Hey, Paul, I'm excited to tell you that we are launching a Curbsiders Patreon. Have you heard about this?
I did because I work with you, but tell me more about it.
All right, Paul. Well, we want to be able to keep offering this great free content, and we're doing things like upgrading our website. We offer transcripts now for episodes, recording new seasons of our miniseries, Teach and Addiction Medicine. The digest is growing its staff. And Paul, now we're on video. People can see us as we're talking right here.
What a treat for our listeners.
That's right. So with Cashlack admitting privileges, they're going to get all episodes ad-free. That's the whole back catalog, plus future episodes. And twice monthly, there's going to be bonus episodes where me and you recap a show and answer some listener questions. So people should sign up today at patreon.com/curbsiders. And you get a whole lot more of Paul, America's PCP.
The Curbsiders podcast is for entertainment, education, and information purposes only, and the topics discussed should not be used solely to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any diseases or conditions. Furthermore, the views and statements expressed on this podcast are solely those of the host and should not be interpreted to reflect official policy or position of any entity, aside from possibly Cashlack Memorial Hospital and its affiliate outreach programs, if indeed there are any. In fact, there are none. Pretty much, we aren't responsible if you screw up. You should always do your own homework and let us know when we're wrong.
Welcome back to the Curbsiders Teach, our mini-series on medical education. I'm Dr. Molly Hoybline, joined by my co-host, Dr. Ira Krzyzewskaja. On tonight's episode, we discuss remediation with Dr. Calvin Chou. Before we get started with that, Ira, will you remind the audience what we do on this show?
You got it, Molly. We are the internal medicine podcast for all things medical education. We use expert interviews to bring you teaching pearls and practice-changing knowledge to inspire the next generation of medical educators. We have a fantastic conversation with Dr. Calvin Chou tonight. We cover basically the ins and outs, the four phases of the possibilities for remediation. So everything remediation that you want to know, we talk about it.
Dr. Calvin Chou, MD, PhD, is a professor of medicine at UCSF and staff physician at the VA in San Francisco. In his work with the Academy of Communication and Healthcare, he leads workshops on relationship-centered communication, feedback, conflict, and remediation in health professions education. He is co-editor of the books Remediation in Medical Education, a Mid-Course Correction, and Communication RX, Transforming Healthcare Through Relationship-Centered Communication.
And a reminder that most episodes are available for free CME credit through VCU Health CE for all health professionals at curbsiders.vcuhealth.org. All you have to do is create an account.
And if you love the content the Curbsiders family produces, we want to encourage you to think about supporting our Patreon. Your support helps pay for audio editing, transcripts, and lets us create accessible, high-quality content that you're used to. The link and so much more resources like show notes, infographics, transcripts, and more are available on our website. So without further ado,
let's get to it.
Hi, Dr. Chou. Thank you so much for joining us again. We're so happy to have you back on the show. Are you okay with us calling you Calvin again for this recording?
Please call me Calvin. And actually, there is an interesting change since the last time we did this podcast. I've changed the way that I pronounce my last name now.
Tell us everything.
Did I just say it wrong and you're trying to find a nice way of correcting me? Or?
Well, it turns out,
Some people say.
How would you know? Because I haven't told you. This is from my friend Gurpreet Dhaliwal,
Yes.
who, he used to go by another first name, shortened first name. And then he said, I remember when I first met him, he said, my name is Gurpreet, but call me, this other thing. And everybody called him that for years and finally decided that, he wanted to be recognized for how he normally would be called in India. And I realized that my last name is the way I pronounce it is the way it looks in America, but that's not the way my ancestors pronounced it. So I'm wanting to bring that into my story now. So now I say my last name is Chou. Chou, it's so it's more like a J than a CH.
So Joe?
Yeah. You can say like JOE would be fine, would be closer than the prior.
Great.
I love that, Calvin.
There we are.
I will say I'm going through a similar identity crisis where I'm trying to decide if I'm going to stop going by Dr. K and start going by Dr. Krzyzewskaja. But I find that telling people that everything after the K is silent used to be my go-to. And now I have to figure out a way to say all those letters in a way that's, understandable for people. So I hear you.
It's claiming our history. right? And I think that's so important in this day and age, not only for us as attending people, but transition for our learners as well, who, if you are being called by something that you're not used to, or you're kowtowing to the prevalent society, then that every time you hear your name mispronounced or not pronounced the way you want, then that's extra cognitive load. And every time you think, well, that's not the way I want it, but I'm okay with it, when you're really not. That extra cognitive load can then, over time, contribute to struggling. How's that for a transition?
That was incredible. It was,
That was incredible. I feel like we should pivot the whole recording and just talk about identity and
names and pronunciations. Yes. And what that means for us as both educators and, people who are trying to live out their full identity or be fully themselves. But on a totally fun, kind of less serious note, anything that you've enjoyed consuming, book, movie, show, plays, anything that you want to share with the audience?
I will say that my latest consumption, latest delight in consumption, are some K-dramas. So, it started out with, I'm going to plug two. The first one is called Crash Landing on You. Yes?
Yes, have watched it multiple times, obsessed, but go on.
Obsessed, right? And so one of my patients who turned me on to this, he said, if you like Schitt's Creek, you should watch Crash Landing on You. And then I told him, I loved Crash Landing on You. And he said, if you like Crash Landing on You, you should watch Extraordinary Attorney Woo.
I haven't seen that one.
Which is this K-drama about a newly graduated law school lawyer who has autism, who is on the spectrum, and her way of dealing with all of the barriers and the prejudice that comes up by being who she is, and the way that, because in part she's brilliant, and in part because she's quirky, and in part because she's human, she really overcomes a lot of these barriers, and has the most amazing boyfriend ever. Some of her colleagues who kind of look at her askance come to appreciate her. It's an amazing arc. So I recommend that.
I love that. I also love that you compared Crash Landing on You to Schitt's Creek, because I feel like people don't recognize the comedy in K-dramas. Like, there's so much moment. I laughed out loud, even reading subtitles and kind of, the lighting and the music. I was just like, these characters, these actors are hilarious. And I feel like that's sometimes not as showcased as much as the drama,
Exactly. And Ira, probably that the title characters of Crash Landing
are
on You,
married.
they're actually married and have a kid now. So that's like North and South Korea baby now that they have, sort of.
I love that.
Ira, I don't know how you have so much time to watch TV with how many things you have going on, but
you know what's so secret? Because the thing that I was going to plug is also a Netflix show. The secret is that sometimes I watch things on 1.5 speed or 2x speed, and sometimes I fast forward through storylines, like other Netflix shows that I may talk about in a second that I don't enjoy. So sometimes I will kind of like skip past that. But Crash Landing on You, I actually gave it the full 1x. I was watching it at normal speed because it was just so good. But you do have to, I think, at some point, like have some like magical thinking and like suspend disbelief.
Of course. I mean, a rich heiress hang glides across the DMZ literally into the arms of a North Korean soldier. Not exactly believable.
It's probably happened. Could be happening right now.
Oh, good point.
Well, that kind of sounds like you are ready for Picks of the Week, Ira. You want to share with us?
I might be Molly, but then again, I also wanted to make sure that did you have a pick of the week before I launch into my Netflix binge?
Sure, yeah. So a place that I've gone to a couple times lately, and I apologize to the listeners who are not local in the Bay Area, but have you guys been to the Presidio Tunnel Tops?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, beautiful new park.
So beautiful new park in San Francisco. It overlooks the bay. It overlooks the Golden Gate Bridge. There's this amazing playground that both my 11-year-old and my 3-year-old really enjoyed, which is like a big challenge to find things they both like. Just really natural, really beautiful, amazing plantings. Just every step you're like, whoa, it's a whole new place to explore. And they have food trucks almost every day. So you get great food options.
I
love all of that.
I was going to talk about those food trucks. Oh, amazing.
Well, as the exact antithesis to the outside beautiful nature food trucks, my pick of the week is actually the next season of Indian Matchmaking on Netflix. Molly and I sometimes joke that I don't often give credit to some of the more cringe shows that are out there, and this is my moment to plug those shows because Calvin, you know, Crash Landing, I feel like elevates things, drama. Indian Matchmaking is drama that is, I don't know if it's necessarily elevated. It's more cringy. Like I found myself going, ooh, and certain things that this matchmaker, Seema Auntie, would say. I would immediately text my friends and be like, did you just hear that? And they'd be like, yeah, I can't believe it. And so if anybody wants to go through kind of the storylines of people living in London, people living in India, people living actually in the Bay Area too. There's some folks from Davis. There's some folks from San Francisco in it, North Carolina. It's really all over, and a focus on London this year or this season. I just laughed and cringed and kind of was like, there's so much to discuss here. So I feel like if you want something that you can maybe go 1.5x or 2x on or skip through until the, storylines of the people that you're interested in, it's really interesting. And I just find that they highlight both matchmaking that has worked out from this matchmaker and ones that did not, and kind of why that is. There's a lot of topics for discussion.
Whoa.
Yeah. Well, Ira and I were just at a conference together in Austin, and she knows the names of every character on the show. So
I do.
I actually didn't know there was a new season. Thank you for letting me know.
It may have come out approximately 3 days ago, but it's fine. It's totally fine.
Okay. It sounds like Ira has watched all of it already.
Oh, man. Well, let's jump into the actual topic of our discussion today: remediation. Not matchmaking. We have a case to get us kicked off. Lauren is a third-year medical student who's meeting with you, her longitudinal coach, as a check-in during her intersession week. She's had a hard time with clerkship year, she says, not because of new rotations or environment constantly changing or new teams, but that she's struggling because shelf exams really got her down. Lauren has failed 2 out of the last 4 exams, even though she studied for weeks before the test. She tells you she's just not been a good test taker, and she worries about her future board exams. You've also seen written evaluations from her clerkship attendings over the past few months that her clinical knowledge is slightly below where they would expect her to be, almost halfway through her clerkships. So, Calvin, this scenario feels common. Could we start off with how you define remediation, and practically how might you introduce the idea of remediation to a learner?
Sure. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I think we all have had experiences, not just with learners who we see might be struggling, but also with ourselves. I think if we are completely honest, if every single one of us is completely honest, we have struggled with something at some point during our career. And so this idea of remediation, it has such a negative connotation to it. And yet, if we think about it, reframe it in terms of how can I get through a time in my life when I was struggling professionally, maybe there's some personal aspects to that as well, then that, to me, ought to demystify it some, because we've all had similar experiences. So if I formally define remediation as we defined it in the first edition of our remediation book from many years ago now, it's the act of facilitating a correction for trainees who started on the path toward becoming a healthcare professional and have moved off course. And so I think of them as these three different levels. Number one is struggling some and able to make a course correction, either with some help or not. Remediation, which is needing a formal plan or else, and those folks are closer to being dismissed from a program, and then dismissal. So kind of those several different levels. So when we talk about Lauren's case here, it's because she has failed a couple of exams. It's not just a single one-time thing, and she kind of realized what it was or got a little bit of extra help and then did better. It's a couple of different exams, and so now we're needing to think more broadly about what are the places where we can help Lauren succeed in the best way that she can. I've talked a lot. I don't want to go on and on because I could go on forever.
I'm glad you broke that down in that way, Calvin, because before we recorded today, I was trying in my mind to differentiate feedback conversations that are sort of more corrective from actual remediation. And I think you're highlighting kind of that middle ground of, it's not just the one-off that needs a little redirection, but really more of a pattern that needs a formal plan to get someone back on track. So that's helpful for me. Thank you.
And Calvin, you can let me know if this is the time at which we, initiate a role play or a role rehearsal. But if we want to, save that juicy part to the end, I guess my question was kind of with Lauren, you're meeting with her and you're, presumably at some point going to introduce this idea or kind of introduce the topic. And, sometimes there's a lot of negative connotation to remediation, and wondering with her in your introduction of it, are you kind of framing this as an opportunity for growth as opposed to like a referendum on her? And kind of how do you are a skillful person, so how do you skillfully do that so that our listeners can try to do the same?
Yeah. So I think even before we get to the conversation, we'll get to don't worry. I'll make you role play.
I'm literally on the edge of my seat. You can't tell, but I can't go any further. I will fall off.
Relax for a little bit because I have several more things for contextualization before we get to that conversation. Okay.
Okay.
So I think I think about the four phases of remediation that we need to figure out what's going on with Lauren first. All right. This particular structure is one that I very much like. It is, there are four phases: identification, clarification, intervention, and assessment, right? So identification is the phase where you're denoting, oh, this person is struggling. And we're at that stage right now because Lauren has now failed 2 exams. So then the next step is clarification. In this stage, we basically set up a conversation where we're trying to figure out the differential diagnosis, so to speak, for why this learner is undergoing these struggles. The third stage is intervention, where once you have developed this clarification, gotten a broader sense of what might be happening, then that's where you collaboratively develop an individualized learning plan and implement it iteratively with coaches, with specific people who can help, and a lot of documentation. I'll get to documentation a little bit later. And then finally, assessment. And there's 2 levels of assessment. One is obviously assessing the learner. Have they made the steps that they need to in order to succeed? And assessing the program, assessing the plan, assessing whether or not we as an institution, whether it's a program or a school or a university, have we done the right thing by this learner and thereby for other learners as well? And what do we need to change in that overall process in order to allow further learners to succeed? So when we talk about remediation, it's not just about a learner and me as the attending, or and me as the coach. It is a bigger pot. It's whether that learner is succeeding in the context of an institution that maybe supports remediation, maybe doesn't. So there are many outside factors that influence the need for remediation in an individual learner. And sometimes our learners are, for example, in the clarification phase, one of the things that often happens with learners is that there's something in their lives that is happening. And a parent is ill. They're having a child. It's many different things that can interfere with, quote, performance. And if we took those away, they may do fine, but with those extra stresses and cognitive loads, they're not. So that's why the clarification phase is really important.
Yeah. How specifically in Lauren's case would you try to, I mean, of course, hopefully you have a relationship with her. You can try to see if she's comfortable sharing those personal things. Do you also reach out to, get more background from some of those assessors who wrote comments about her? Or how do you kind of formalize that process?
All of that. So okay, here we are, Ira. you want to play Lauren, and
it's happening. It's happening. Sure.
You're coming to me. I'm your.
Sitting back, relaxing.
I did. I actually sat back for a second, but it's okay. I'm ready. I'm so ready.
So I'm your longitudinal coach. You're coming to
Yes.
me. It's come to my attention that you've failed these couple of exams, and you're coming to me knowing that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's like that element of insight, which I think Lauren has, that maybe not all the people that come to you, Calvin specifically, tend to have.
Right. So if we recap the feedback conversations, I'm going to use that same approach here: ask, respond, teach. So I'm going to ask Lauren first before I just say, "Hey, Lauren, you're failing exams. You need to do better." That's not what I'm going to do here, because I'm going to do my best to help Lauren. All right. So you ready?
Yes.
All right. Lauren, thanks for coming to my office today. I know I know it's kind of a trip.
Oh, Calvin, no, this is great. Thank you so much for kind of making the time during this busy intersession week. I know you have a lot of us as your coachees, and so I just really appreciate finding the time to talk about what's been going on.
I'm delighted to talk to you. I remember last time we talked, you were talking about Indian matchmaking or something like that. Is he still watching that?
I am, a new season just started, but don't worry. I only watched it after my surgery clerkship ended. And it was actually kind of something I tried to do to make myself feel better, because the clerkship kind of ended on a bit of a low note with the shelf.
Oh yeah. Tell me about the low note.
Well, I felt like I was studying. I was doing, I was reading that book that people tell me to read, the case logs or something. And I just felt like I got to the shelf exam and, maybe they were just asking more medicine questions than I was ready for, or maybe there was stuff covered that I didn't see during my rotation. I haven't had medicine yet. And so after psychiatry, this is the second clerkship exam that I've failed. And I'm just really worried because, there's more exams ahead of me. And I don't know what's going on to make me, I guess I've never really been the best test taker, but it just feels like these two in the last, 4 rotations feel like I'm worried, basically.
I'm really glad you're bringing this here. We want you to succeed to the best ability that you can, and I want to support you as best as I can as well. So I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of questions to figure out more deeply what the struggle might be. It's interesting to me that during the first pre-clerkship phase, you didn't fail a whole bunch of exams there. So I'm interested in a change between then and now. And wondering, sometimes there are things that are happening on the clerkships that are causing extra worry for you, or sometimes there are things that happen outside of clerkships that are affecting you. And I wonder whether there's something like that going on for you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Calvin. I think I've loved third year. I love the team dynamics. I've loved the actually kind of enjoyed the switches that we've had to do, every few weeks to the different rotations. I think you are making me think more about what could be going on outside of school. And living in San Francisco has been hard. I feel like I hemorrhage money all the time. One of the things I have been trying to do in the last 3 months actually is move. So like look for a new apartment. So I will say that I have been on the days off that I've been doing other things. I try to save some time to like read those case logs and some of the things that my, fourth year senior students have told me to do. But I will say there are other things. There are other priorities for me, and maybe that has gotten in the way. But I just, like you said, pre-clerkship I wasn't acing everything, wasn't 100%, but I definitely didn't fail, exams like this. So I'm a little worried about this piece.
Yeah, I think it's completely normal for somebody who is, in the middle of busy clerkships and also trying to find a new place to live and worried about money, all of those things, that can definitely take a toll on you. And it can show up in performance like this. And so I want to be the best help that I can for you, and also want to make clear to you that obviously you're worried about this. I'm worried about it too. If this becomes a consistent pattern, this is not consistent with successful graduation for medical school, right? So we want to make certain that you're successful here.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about it in that perspective. And, I've gotten emailed by the surgery clerkship and the psychiatry clerkship to say, when do you want to reschedule taking your exam? Because we need you to pass. And, with the psychiatry exam, it was literally 1 point. I was 1 point below. So I do think there's hope. But I appreciate you reminding me that this is like a passing, like I have to do this to pass medical school. And I guess I wonder, like, is anyone else struggling like me, or is like this, no one else feels this way? Because feels very alone.
Other people definitely struggle. And I want to make certain that you don't continue to struggle. I know it's scary for me to say, hey, this is a potential barrier to graduation. And I don't want to be dishonest about this. Honestly, if this continues, the clerkship directors aren't going to want to pass you, and I think that is something for us to look out for. Mm-hmm. And what we need to do then, therefore, is to give you the support that you need in order to succeed.
Yeah, I guess I will have to take you up on figuring out what that support looks like.
Yeah, it was nice to watch both of you. Calvin, you really did a nice job normalizing it for her, and I could almost hear some of those same sorts of questions I ask when I'm trying to get patients to open up a little bit more. And I think we're all pretty comfortable with sort of, laying it out there that there might be options, and just, sort of opening up that conversation to help people feel more comfortable. And then you were pretty hard hitting in saying, you might not pass this clerkship. And I think that's something that learners need to hear. But then you really pivoted to, and we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to support you so that doesn't happen. So I don't know how it felt sitting in your seat, but I felt a little bit of a punch in the gut, like, I can't graduate med school.
Well, I did. I also realized I don't have a career in acting, despite my best efforts. But no, I really appreciate that, Calvin, because I did that. Like, it was kind of we came full circle, like 180. We started off with like you being like, and this is a requirement in order to graduate medical school. And I'm like, oh my God, like I might not finish medical school, to also being like, and there are steps we can take to help you succeed, and I will support you. And that kind of, ending with that, just like Molly said, it really did feel like I wasn't alone in that. And even though, we weren't about to get into like my housing struggles or what other, time management struggles in that exact moment, I felt like this was somebody who's actually listening to me and, cared about my future. Do you find, Calvin, that in people in Lauren's stage that like medical knowledge or test taking tends to be developmentally the source of struggle at that point? Or do you find that like your remediation conversations are, medical knowledge is through the entire gamut, or, other people are struggling with different things at different times?
Yeah. So I was looking at data about medical knowledge. So let me just say that medical knowledge remediation is not my complete area of expertise. I've done it. I think this is where specialists in each of the competencies really helps, because you can really delve into medical knowledge remediation or clinical reasoning remediation, or for me, interpersonal communication or professionalism remediation. I know those two fields inside and out, and so I have specific ways of approaching learners who have challenges in those areas. And I think it takes experts really in those areas to be able to hone in on what a learner's individual struggles are and help them the best. So really, ultimately, from an institutional standpoint, developing experts in each of these competency areas to help learners in the best way possible is the right way to go. And the other thing I want to say, and I've lost track of your question, but I do want to say one more thing, and that is that we talked at the top of the show about identity, and I wasn't planning on this, but learners who struggle and know that they're in remediation, that becomes an identity for them. I know I'm struggling, and what do I do about that? And oftentimes there's stereotype threat that comes with that. So, if I'm struggling, I'm going to do everything I can to get out of it. And exactly the behaviors that they shouldn't be doing are the things that they generally do. And that digs them deeper and deeper in the hole. So this is why this conversation with you, Ira, as Lauren, with showing complete support and validation for what you are going through, in the same way that we talked about in the feedback episode, 4-to-1, the validation is what interferes with stereotype threat. This is even more important in somebody who is undergoing struggles.
I was curious about, when you started thinking about asking Lauren about her study habits, and I have no idea I know what works for me, but I don't know what would be considered good study habits. In addition to your book, if someone who's listening works at a smaller program or doesn't have the resources of institutional backup to get these experts in different content areas, can you think of, off the top of your head, any resources that might be good for people to check out, or recommendations of sort of how to build those experts?
I know that most institutions have a learning specialist of some kind. Definitely all medical schools that I know of. And I think most health profession schools have access to a learning specialist. And so identifying some of the learning needs that learners have is really important, because that allows them to succeed.
I guess I wonder, with this learning specialist that, Lauren or but most folks that have kind of attachment in academic center have access to. And you mentioned earlier, medical knowledge is not the area that you typically kind of remediate on. Are you then, is it there's literally a handoff process where you would tell Lauren, I would like you to meet with learning specialists, or do you kind of hand off or include a team for remediation? And let's say it is, for, we just had an episode on professionalism, but let's say it is professionalism or an interpersonal communication issue. How is the kind of, process done by a team or other people separate from just you?
So there is, what an important question. Ideally, there would be resources for a remediation program that when a learner is struggling, we can say, okay, you can go to the procedures remediation specialist, or you can go to the clinical reasoning remediation specialist. I don't know of really any medical school or residency that has that, ready to go. And so most folks are doing this voluntarily. So here's where whatever resources you have can be useful. For medical knowledge remediation, oftentimes peers or near peers can be really helpful. Because particularly those who are doing well, and they have told you, these are the study skills I use, and you hear them and you think, okay, these are exactly the scientifically based study skills that I would want somebody to have. Having a near peer work with that is really, really important. You can also convene groups where somebody who is interested in medical knowledge remediation convenes a group of students. The remediation expert or the interested faculty person helps collect the useful strategies that each of the students is doing, and then each of the students has a support group. There's some data that suggests that remediation groups can really be helpful, with the caveat that sometimes what happens in those groups is that the struggles compound each other. So it has to be somebody who's relatively skilled in facilitation. And the reason that I know anything about medical knowledge remediation is because of this chapter that was written in our book. And so I go to it and I think, okay, I think I can talk about these things. I don't know exactly how to operationalize each one of them, but talking about individual study skills and asking folks like, are you taking breaks? Are you interleaving? Yeah. Are you asking questions of yourself afterwards? Are you covering the answers to the multiple choice exam so that you can immediately come up with what the issue is? Can you write a multiple choice exam that will give you a better sense of the mastery of the material? So there's many different options, many different avenues where you don't have to have a whole bunch of training. They kind of make sense, and you still have to know about them. And fortunately, most of these things are, at least in terms of study skills, there is now a literature on this that supports the fact that studying in these specific ways really, really helps. Like I used to study just biochemistry, and that apparently is not the way to do it. You study biochemistry and microbiology, and then you interleave your learning, because different parts of your brain are making different connections, and that way you learn better.
Calvin, can we just pay you for a second? Because I feel like you are a plant, because we have an episode coming up about science of learning, and it's talking about all of these. So I feel like you are either a kind of wise wizard and knew that this was happening, because for all listeners who are like, what is interleaving? These amazing words, these pearls that Calvin's dropping, please see our episode on the science of learning, where we will go into in-depth things, because I just appreciate you teasing listeners with those topics.
Science of learning, that's I think this is exactly relevant to medical knowledge remediation.
And I think all those study skills, that kind of approach makes a lot of sense. And I can absolutely see that being valuable for learners. I kind of feel like when medical students or residents get into the clinical side of things, it can be just so broad. Do you have any kind of best practices about how to actually focus on what's important? How to figure out what might be on the test or what might they need to know for a specific rotation?
If I knew the answer to that question, that we wouldn't be here. A lot of it is, things that are passed down from generations. Some of it is, Q-Bank questions. Like if you do all of the Q-Bank questions, you're probably going to be able to forecast what's going to come at you. Some of it is, near peers who have done the exam more recently, and they can say, "Oh, make sure you study this." I think a lot of this is not just about learning the individual facts. A lot of it is also sociocultural. That having connections with other people who can help you not only understand what the exam is going to be like, but also get support from those folks when you need help. It's study buddies, making certain that that you're getting enough sleep and exercise, and you're studying at times that are most productive for you. I mean, there's all kinds of little adaptations that that groups of people can help support learners who struggle with, and also therefore which are lifelong, instead of just pass this exam. Just what's the term? Pump and dump. Don't pump and dump, right? It's about
May apply to breastfeeding and also medical knowledge. All those things. Well, Calvin, I feel like this is super helpful because to use your framework of the 4 phases, I feel like we've passed the identification phase, we've clarified, we're moving on to intervention, like what are we actually going to do? And obviously we'll touch on in a second kind of the assessment phase. I wonder, would it be different if Lauren was an intern and the kind of intervention that we would be planning would be maybe is around organization or trying to help her kind of see more than 3 patients before rounds? Like if there was kind of a different identification of the struggle, how would, our intervention change there?
Very complicated, right? Because it looks that Lauren's phenotype as an intern is that she's not finishing her notes on time or not pre-rounding in time for rounds. Maybe that's because, so this is all about clarification again. Maybe that's because of a medical knowledge issue. Maybe that's because she's a woman of color and her patients of color love her and just like this is the only doctor of color that they see, and so she's spending a lot of time with them and therefore not able to make it to rounds on time. Maybe because her clinical reasoning is slow. Maybe because there is truly an executive function issue, not being able to organize stuff and just needs practice going through that, needs her system. So again, we're back at the clarification phase where we need to note that this is happening, and then ask and note over time, what the specific struggles are in the various possible domains, and then eventually get to intervention. You'd asked a question earlier about the prevalence of medical knowledge issues, and I looked this up. It's something like 40% of medical students who struggle have a medical knowledge issue, and something like 60% of residents have a medical knowledge issue. That said, it's a lot easier to ascribe somebody who's struggling to medical knowledge than it is to clinical reasoning or executive function or communication or professionalism. There's lots of, so this is where the clarification phase is of utmost importance. I can tell you that, doing communication remediation, people get sent to me and their communication is fine. It is that their clinical reasoning is needing help. So this is why I know a little bit about medical knowledge remediation. Why I know a little bit about clinical reasoning remediation is because people come to me billed as one way, and all of a sudden I find myself needing to do something else.
And for someone like Lauren's coach, you've clarified, you've kind of got this plan together in place. Who do you kind of, beyond the people that are directly involved in putting out the plan, who do you involve in knowing that she's part of this remediation journey? Do you tell her clerkship directors, the dean, and do you let Lauren know that?
So this is from merely struggling to more of the remediation phase.
Right, she's in the remediation phase. You have a remediation plan. Do you sort of give the person, the attending on her next rounds a heads up, or how much do you feed that forward?
Yeah, so all really great questions. If somebody is in a formal remediation plan, then the dean of student affairs and curricular affairs probably need to know about it, or the program director, or the clinical competence committee, where whichever, or the equivalent bodies, and that remediation plan requires an individualized learning plan. It requires documentation every single time you meet with that student. Remediation coach who meets with that learner. Documentation has to happen. And I'll just forecast one of the things that people worry about most with remediation is, well, we can't possibly dismiss that learner because they're going to sue us. And the data are very, very clear, both in undergraduate medical education and graduate medical education, that there was this really interesting paper that was published about 3 years ago where they documented every case that went to the U.S. District or Supreme Court or appeals courts related to a learner who was dismissed. And all of those cases were dismissed except for one. And that one case was where the school did not do due process and follow their rules and document appropriately. That's the only case in the last 40 years that has ever gone to, and that wasn't found. I think that the result of that wasn't found in favor of the learner. It was like, okay, school, you need to do a better job with this. So we worry a lot. Programs worry a lot about lawsuits, and if you do the due diligence, you don't have to worry about that at all. And that's why the documentation for anybody who's in a remediation plan needs to be done, because God forbid it should happen. It happens on a non-zero basis, and so that's where the documentation is helpful. And documentation really. It's better for everybody. It's better for the learner. This is where you are. I'm going to show you exactly where you are, or even better, having the learner email you back. Okay, can you summarize for us what you learned in our session today? And if the learner can summarize that, then that's like the teach back of the feedback conversations that we were talking about before.
And so that's more about kind of programmatically. Do you also kind of feed it forward to her attendings on rotations and that kind of situation?
I keep on asking. I keep on answering a different question. I'm sorry.
That's okay. You're excited about this.
We ask all the hard questions, Calvin. They're just keeping you on your toes.
So feeding forward, the data are really, really interesting about feed forward as well. So there are data from non-medical sources, I think in music schools and one other kind of school where there is a big risk with feed forward, because then the learner gets labeled and they don't then bias on behalf of the faculty and the evaluators comes into play. And there also are data that suggests that if you can separate the bias from the information, that actually does help learners. There's this recently a paper published from deans of student affairs at 3 or 4 different schools where they went through their feed forward process. The fact that it was helpful, and apparently a lot of other deans of student affairs didn't like that because of the bias that might be involved there. So we have to be really careful with a feed forward system, as long as we are very, very clear that we are doing this feed forward in order to help the learner and feeding forward specific behaviors, back to the feedback conversation we had earlier, specific behaviors, specific goals that we're working on, as opposed to, this learner is really weak. Then I'm going to look at everything that learner does as if they're a weak learner. So I think specificity is hugely important, and this orientation toward helping the learner, supporting the learner in the best way that we can. I think those are the cornerstones of feed forward, and again, those reflect the definition of feedback that we talked about last time.
And Calvin, I love that we have kind of dove into each phase of the remediation process. And in terms of the 4th phase, which, after identification, clarification, intervention comes the assessment. I wonder with Lauren, what's the plan or what's the typical plan for you in terms of the follow-up that happens and checking in? Have they made the steps that you asked them to make, and then have we assessed their plan or the program overall?
Right. Ideally, you'd have different people playing different roles in the remediation process. So you have people who identify the learner, and that person can also be the remediation coach, and the person or people or body who ultimately decide whether the learner succeeds or not should be different from the remediation coach. Because if the remediation coach is also in a position of power, then that's a conflict of interest, and I think that can set the learner up for failure, because the learner says, "But I thought you were supporting me, and now you're telling me that I'm being dismissed." That's a real problem. So I think this is one reason why residency programs have clinical competence committees is because it's not just one person who's making a decision. It's a lot of people looking at a whole bunch of different data with oftentimes those data are conflicting. And so how does that committee develop the judgment, not the judgmentalness, but the good judgment in order to come down with a decision that respects not only the learner's efforts, but also respects our contract with society, which is if somebody graduates medical school or residency, we have to say that they're fit to practice. And I think in that the episode that you had with Ben Kinnear, I love that episode where he's talking about, sometimes that there's this study from Europe where a lot of people said, there are people who I wouldn't have take care of my parents. That is also validated by another study that was done at the University of Colorado, or not just the University of Colorado. Those were the authors, but they surveyed lots of different programs in the United States, where almost, I think 80% of programs said, yeah, we graduated somebody that we shouldn't have. And that's not acceptable. So we have to support our learners, and we also have this compact with society where we have to stand by every single graduate and support them. And sometimes if it gets to the point where we have to say, we really tried, and that's and it's not going to work.
Well, Calvin, in the spirit of graduating kind of competent physicians, this might be a noob question, but do we have data that remediation works? Like, does it do what it needs to do in terms of, helping us graduate competent physicians and ensuring that the people who are going into the world and into the workforce are the people that we'd want taking care of our family, and that the remediation has been successful?
It depends on what kind of data you're looking at. If you're looking at randomized control trials, there are no such trials. And also, it would be really hard to randomize learners who are struggling to one arm versus the other arm and see who succeeds, because I think we have to try to support all of our learners. So there are no randomized controlled data. And there is enough variability between the various ways that various institutions approach the learners who struggle, that it's very, very hard to show those data. Now, so most of the data that we have is essentially the best we know how to do from an educational standpoint. If we maximize the best learning strategies, educational strategies, and educational structures for our learners, and this is not just for learners who require remediation. This is for all of our learners. This is one other thing that Ben Kinnear was talking about in his episode was the CCC at his institution turned from looking at residents and saying, okay, this person really needs help, identify just those people, and instead looking at how is this person succeeding. And that frame shift is so important, not just for learners requiring remediation. They're also required for everybody in medical health sciences, health professions, education. So I think it's proof of concept as opposed to data that say, you get this intervention and you succeed.
And Calvin, you mentioned kind of assessment of the individual learner, like Lauren herself. But at the beginning, you mentioned sort of assessment of the whole program in response to that immediate remediation issue. Can you think of an example that you'd feel comfortable sharing if something comes to the top of your head of a situation where a remediation case has actually led to changes in the broader system?
There's a program that I was helping along that's CashLack-like, where it was a small program with very few learners. One of the learners was having difficulty, and that had reverberations throughout the program because if you take that learner off service, then the other 3 or 4 people have to cover a third or a quarter of the service instead of taking a medical student out of a class of 160. Maybe the impact isn't so large. And so what they realized when they had this issue is that they didn't have the structure with which to support the learner who was struggling, and they didn't have a structure by which to support the learners who were left, the higher performing learners. And so this really brought into relief what other things they needed in order for a remediation program to exist, because this was not going to be their last struggling learner. So
I think thanks to COVID, we all got pretty deep in figuring out backup plans. So
it was kind of like that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You had mentioned earlier, thinking about how feeding forward can increase bias, and we know that certainly there's bias in medical evaluations. And how do you think about remediation if you're working with a learner who's an underrepresented in medicine, or some other characteristic that might kind of potentially predispose them to bias?
I think bringing in a lot of what we have said before, I think anybody who is in remediation already has a label on them that makes them in remediation. So a lot of the same principles that apply to any kind of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging work apply here. So I like to think about the various levels at which DEIB work, what influences we can bring to learners, and I think about the intrapersonal level, the interpersonal level, and then the systemic levels. So intrapersonally, as somebody who's involved in remediation, I have to be very, very aware of whatever implicit biases I'm bringing. And sometimes that's very, very hard work, and work that we get quite resistant to. And I ask myself all the time, I have this learner who's struggling, and I'm having a reaction to them. How much of this is because there's a characteristic about them that I am reacting against, and maybe I'm not the right remediation coach, or getting extra help so that we can have that learner succeed. So that's intrapersonal implicit bias. Then there's the interpersonal things, which are one of the things that I almost always lead with, particularly in every single remediation case, is a location of self. So a location of self statement, which says, I am a gay Asian doctor, dad, and as with these identities, I know what it's like to feel excluded from society, and I also have no idea what it might be like for you as a person of color with thus and such background, and I want to make certain that we have dialogue about what kinds of influences there are in your life, so that I have a better sense of how to help you, because I'm here for your success, right? So some kind of location of self introduction with a learner, and then awareness about the forces that may be affecting their performance. So stereotype threat, we already talked some about. Microaggressions, if a learner is, because of the way they look or the way they are undergoing frequent, or even not frequent, but any microaggression whatsoever, comments about the way they look, or making them feel like they don't belong, then those are things to take into account as I'm continuing with the coaching process. And then there's the more systemic things like, sometimes some of our learners who have marginalized identities also are trying to take care of their parents or their children or their families at home. And so this is, again, back to this clarification phase. What kinds of external influences are there that may be interfering with the possibility that this learner can devote their entire cognitive space to the practice of health of medicine.
Well, this has been just a great framework to think about remediation, and I really appreciate how you went into kind of the nitty gritty of what that actually looks like in practice. Are there things that you feel like we've skipped over, or important points that you feel like we need to cover before we get to take-home points?
Don't you think that's enough? I think that's
I think it's enough, but you always
I feel
have
like
more,
it's so chewy. We have what we've talked about. But what are your take-home points, Calvin? I feel like there's, if we could solidify them.
Yeah. Okay. So one is remediation can mean a couple of different things. It can mean a person who's struggling a little bit, or somebody who is needing a formal remediation plan. And obviously, there's a continuum there. The second one is identification, clarification, intervention, assessment. That rubric, I like to think of it as IDCIA. It's like, and I think of CIA not as the Central Intelligence Agency, but as the Culinary Institute of America, where we're trying to identify things to help people become more delectable and delicious in their careers. Remediation
Love
feedback
that.
on steroids. The different roles of the people involved in remediation. So somebody who's identifying the learner, the remediation coach, and then a separate arbiter where they're able to take a whole bunch of different information, put it together, and make an ultimate defensible decision. And then documentation. If you're in that remediation phase, documentation, and institutions are supported, at least in the U.S., by court decisions that, as long as due process is held, don't worry so much about this. Don't worry so much about the lawsuits. Just do your job.
Nailed it.
Thank you so much. Anything else that you'd like to plug? Anything that you have coming down the pipeline, or in addition to your book, anything else that you're especially proud of?
I was going to say,
Another
funny you should
do's
ask.
and don'ts article. Yeah.
What was that?
I said another do's and don'ts article, like the ones that you from 2019.
Yeah, I love doing that article, and there was it's interesting that article came out in 2019, and since then I've learned so much more about remediation, a lot of which is in the book that's going to be coming out end of August, September 2023. So that's exciting, and it's interesting, now that I've had to read through that book and read through the book and read through the book, even after that, there are new things that are in the literature that aren't in the book. So it's an ongoing, evolving field, and the idea that we can continue to learn. There's nothing that has refuted anything in the book. It's just additional detail that has been really helpful to reflect on. So it's an exciting place to be. I would say that remediation is such a it's such a labor of love. It's a way to really support our learners who need us the most, and it really gives me a lot of joy to see the folks succeed at the end.
Calvin, I love that.
Thank you
Everyone
so much.
must
This
get
has been
Calvin's
great.
book.
Yes.
Thank you for all your time. Talk to your ears off.
It's amazing. Ears are still on. Don't worry. Thank you for this, Calvin. This was great.
Well, Ira, that was such a wonderful conversation with Dr. Chou. I was really happy that we got to sit down with him and really learn so much about remediation. What do you want to take home from this episode?
Wow, Molly, I don't even know where to start because there's so much, but I think within the 4 phases of remediation, so identification, clarification, intervention, and assessment, I want to hone in on assessment because I feel like Calvin really taught me kind of the layers of it, where it's not just the assessment of the learning plan or the program within that the learner is kind of working within and learning within, but also I feel like there's this assessment of self and kind of how am I contributing to this process, also kind of how am I locating myself and thinking about kind of inclusivity and kind of identity throughout this process. So I feel like I really got a lot out of that assessment piece. What about you, Molly? What's your take home?
I really liked how Calvin focused on really tailoring the remediation plan to the specific competency that's lacking. And, you know, kind of his example of it's easy to say that people are having trouble with say communication, but then it's really a medical knowledge issue or vice versa. And so that we as educators need to be mindful of really trying to figure out what is the problem, because we can't help our learners succeed without identifying that correctly. This has been another episode of our Curbsiders mini-series, The Curbsiders Teach. Get your show notes at thecurbsiders.com/teach. A special thanks to Dr. Matt Watto and Dr. Paul Williams for their support for this project, and to Dr. Stuart Brigham for composing our theme music. Thanks to the team at Podpace for editing our audio. Also to our social media team, Andrew Delat on Instagram and John Ung on Twitter. Until next time, I've been Dr. Molly Hoybein.
And we're committed to providing you with high-value, practice-changing knowledge, and to do that, we need your feedback. So please subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts, or contact us at thecurbsidersteach@gmail.com. A reminder that this and most episodes are available for free CME credit for all healthcare professionals at curbsiders.vcuhealth.org. All you have to do is create an account. And I'm Dr. Ira Krishnovskaya. Thank you for joining us today and letting us bring you a little nugget of medical edutainment.